Hey everybody, thanks for checking out another edition of the Liberty Cast. This week we're going to talk about some Second Amendment news, focusing on what a Biden presidency could mean for your Second Amendment rights. Actually, what a Biden presidency could mean for the entire country. We will address the Walter Wallace Jr. shooting in Philadelphia and the riots that predictably ensued. We'll get into election fraud, Hunter Biden's troubles, and a whole lot more straight ahead. Thanks for tuning in, folks. If you're listening, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast content. And if you prefer to watch, go to rumble.com/thelibertycast and subscribe so you never miss an episode. We have a ton to get to, so let's dive right in. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The election is just days away, and by the time some of you hear or see this, it may have already passed. But for those of you who are hearing or seeing this before the election and haven't voted yet, I just wanted to explain to you what is in store. And for those of you who are seeing and hearing this after the election and Biden won, you still need to hear it so that you can be prepared for the fight. Now, I've talked about this before, and perhaps not enough, but something that is going to come down the pike if Biden wins is H.R. 5717. The Firearms Policy Coalition calls this bill the gunpocalypse, and that's a pretty apt description. It is Robert Francis's gun confiscation wet dream. He's going to be Biden's gun czar in charge of taking everyone's guns, and this bill, if it gets passed, provides the pathway to do exactly that. Now, I know my friend Mark Obi thinks I'm being extreme. We're not really friends, but we did have a pretty civil back and forth on Twitter after I mentioned his piece on the show last week, and he seems like a nice enough guy. We don't do guests on the show yet, but maybe when we do, he and I can revisit that discussion. But anyway, let's review some of the provisions that are in this bill. It will create a nationwide gun registry, ban almost all semi-automatic rifles, institute a federal magazine ban, implement national red flag gun confiscation, tax the purchase of firearms at 30% and the purchase of ammunition at 50%, ban patriots under 21 from exercising their Second Amendment rights, ration guns by making it illegal to purchase more than one firearm in a 30-day period, force safe storage requirements on gun owners, ban home builds so you won't be able to build your next AR, ban suppressors, force federal firearm licensees to spend ridiculous amounts of money to comply with new security requirements, expand gun-free zones, and it requires you to obtain a license to buy guns and ammunition. And in order to obtain the license, you will need to complete a live fire exercise. Now, how is a first-time gun buyer going to obtain a gun to use? You can't buy one unless you have the license, and you can't get a gun if you don't have the license. This effectively wipes out gun ownership within a generation. This is Biden's and Robert Francis's plan to take your guns and then some. There are some things in here, and that was not an exhaustive list, but there are some things in here that are not on Biden's plan on his website. And I shouldn't sell Kamala short either. She is as big a gun grabber as those other two. This would be an unmitigated disaster if Biden wins. Now, I don't want to be all Glenn Beck, doom and gloom, so there is a chance that we can hold on to the Senate, and if we do, it'll be okay. If we can retake the House, which is not likely, but it could happen, so if we can do that, it'll be okay. But should the worst happen, this will be an unmitigated disaster. Now, that's not to say that there's nothing we can do should that happen. There's still plenty we can do. We need to petition our senators and our congresspeople and let them know that they need to vote against any and all gun control measures that get brought forward. And they must not put forward any measures that will further infringe on our rights. And I don't just mean that we should call once and lodge a complaint, but we need to be relentless. Call all the time. Whether or not there are any such bills being brought forward or even being considered. And there are ways you can find that out, too. And even if Trump wins, we still need to do this. Because if he does win, it will be because of the silent majority. And we can't afford to be silent any longer. Those days have to end. We got to be bold, and we got to let these people know that we're not just going to stand by and let them run roughshod over us anymore. We're not going to take the high road and play nice. And I'm taking the role of Dalton in this situation and telling you that it's time to not be nice. There are a few other Second Amendment stories I want to get to before we move on to some other topics. The first one, there's a law on the books in Pennsylvania which requires individuals to possess a license to carry during a declared state of emergency. Pennsylvania law also prohibits anyone under the age of 21 from obtaining this license. So you can swear an oath to serve and protect your country with a firearm at 18, but you can't protect yourself with a firearm if you're a civilian. Another incoherent law from the left. But Firearms Policy Coalition has filed a federal Second Amendment lawsuit against the state of Pennsylvania, challenging the law that prevents adults under the age of 21 from carrying a firearm outside of the home for self-defense. So I'll keep an eye on that and let you know how it progresses. But if you're listening from Pennsylvania, please let your voice be heard that this is unacceptable. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals recently denied a petitioner's request to have his gun rights restored after he was convicted of smuggling in 1987. Now, in the late 80s, he must have been convicted of smuggling cocaine, right? So there's absolutely no way he should have his rights restored, right? Wrong. He was convicted of smuggling and copyright infringement of counterfeit cassette tapes. Now, the Gun Control Act explicitly states that crimes punishable by imprisonment for a term exceeding 1 year does not include any federal or state offenses pertaining to antitrust violations, unfair trade practices, restraints of trade, or other similar offenses relating to the regulation of business practices. He was convicted 33 years ago. He made it up to the 11th Circuit Court, so my guess is the guy's record has been clean since. He's probably in his 50s by now, has a family, and wants to protect them the best way he can. I see no reason, provided that he's been a law-abiding citizen since then, that he shouldn't have his Second Amendment rights restored. Last week, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against a petitioner seeking to have firearms returned that were confiscated from a couple as the result of her husband's felony DUI conviction. She wrote a letter to the police explaining that she had an ownership stake in the firearms that were taken from her property. The court's decision in this case says that it's acceptable for the state to relieve you of your property when your spouse breaks the law, even when you lawfully own that property and have done nothing to justify the seizure of that property. And finally, Kyle Rittenhouse has been extradited to Wisconsin to stand trial for the shooting of those three people in self-defense. Lake County Circuit Court Judge Paul Novak denied the defense request to block extradition and told Kyle Rittenhouse that he must make his self-defense claims in a Wisconsin court. I've said this before, but they're looking to make an example of this kid. Rittenhouse has been charged with first-degree intentional homicide, first-degree reckless homicide, attempted first-degree intentional homicide, and 3 other charges in connection with the shooting on August 25th in Kenosha. He faces life in prison for acting in what is a very clear case of self-defense. This is insanity. Speaking of insanity, there was another black man fatally shot by police in Philadelphia, and of course, riots ensued. Now, I'm not going to show the footage of the shooting. I'm sure you've all seen it by now, and I understand that the body cam footage is going to be released soon as well. Now, from what I saw, the police were telling him to drop the knife, and he would not. He kept advancing toward the police, and they were able to get themselves in a position where they could defend themselves and the public safely. And when he wouldn't drop the knife, they stopped the threat. And on cue, Black Lives Matter started rioting and looting. Now, before we get into that, I want to talk about this notion going around that the officers were not properly trained to deal with the situation. And I got into it on social media with a few people who hold this belief, but they clearly had never worn a badge or had any concept of the training that police officers go through. And they certainly have no idea how officers train to deal with people wielding deadly weapons, and in this case, an edged weapon. They had no concept of the use of force continuum, nothing. And one of these individuals was talking about due process before an officer shoots to make sure that it's justified. Now, I don't remember exactly how he put that because I didn't screenshot it, and of course, when I went back to look, he deleted his dumbass comments. So, now I think I've talked about the Tola drill before, and it's more colloquially known as the 21-foot rule. But here's a comparison that I think should make it more accessible to people. In football, the 40-yard dash is used to measure an athlete's speed. But let's say your average young man runs a 40 in 7 seconds. Now, I know that's slow for football, but looking at the footage, he couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 feet away from those officers. At that average speed, it would take less than 1.75 seconds to cover that distance. Now, what can you do in those, and we'll call it 2 seconds? Now, there are videos all over the internet where community activists who rail against the police and their use of force go through shoot, don't shoot scenarios and have come away with a new appreciation for what officers go through in those situations. Now, the question of tasers came up. And why didn't the officers deploy tasers before they went to deadly force? Of course, a taser can be deadly as well, but it falls into the less than lethal category. But anyway, they didn't deploy tasers because they had not been equipped with tasers. About a third of the officers in Philadelphia carry them. These two did not. There was a plan to equip officers with tasers, but it never happened. It's a question of funding, and Danielle Outlaw, the Philadelphia police commissioner, said that taser funding was recently cut by the Philadelphia City Council. That's not the officer's fault. Now, regardless of that, though, this shooting was completely justified. Of course, that it was justified didn't matter to Black Lives Matter. Didn't matter to those rioters. They were just looking for an excuse to engage in this kind of criminal behavior. The shooting of a black man, armed or not, dangerous or not, is all the justification they need to start rioting. It's almost as though they hope for something like this to happen so they can take to the streets. But it doesn't have to happen like this. These riots don't have to go on for days on end. If they just allowed the police to do their job. But apparently the police in Philadelphia were given a stand-down order by Deputy Commissioner Melvin Singleton. Now, according to reports, the officers on the streets are very frustrated that in order to disperse rather than arrest rioters and looters, because it offers no deterrent for this nonsense. And they're right. Stand-down orders lead to scenes like this.
Oh shit! Oh shit! Damn! They run! Oh! Get him! Yeah! Yeah. Yeah. That's what I like. What the fuck I like? Yeah, that's what I like. Yeah. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Yo. Yo. Yo.
Now, for our audio listeners, what was on the screen was a group of Philadelphia police officers being chased and having objects thrown at them as they retreated. Now, this video broke my heart because you know that none of those officers wanted to retreat. They wanted to make arrests. They wanted to keep the city safe. That's why they put on the uniform. But all that does is embolden these criminals and reinforce the notion that the police don't deserve your respect. You don't have to comply with their orders, which is the attitude that has led to so many of these fatal interactions with the police. As long as we have these impotent police commissioners and city officials allowing this type of behavior, we're going to see these scenarios play out all across the country. And the Black Lives Matter Antifa crowd is going to continue to engage in this behavior because the country is so racist. And the authorities will continue to allow it as an apology for being so racist. It's a circular logic and as such has no resolution. Last week, we really got into this whole voter election fraud issue and how there are people out there who don't think that it's a real issue. Well, here are a couple of more instances of election fraud. And I've been using the term voter fraud and election fraud interchangeably, but there is a difference between election fraud and voter fraud. And what we're about to talk about is election fraud or election interference. First, in Kentucky, there were 112 absentee ballots found in a dumpster. These were ballots that had been requested, but never made it to the voters who requested them. This was a couple of weeks ago, and the people affected obviously still had time to request new ballots up until the 28th of October. But the fact remains that someone took it upon themselves to interfere with the election process and attempt to deprive these people of their vote. Now, in Butler County, Pennsylvania, 40,000 registered voters requested mail-in absentee ballots, but less than 10,000 have been returned. An official with the post office has said that they are unaware of any delays that could have caused these ballots to not show up. But the county has received over 10,000 phone calls regarding the ballots that were requested but never received. The president of the American Postal Workers Union, Chuck Bugar, said that there is no pile of ballots that have been taken from the Butler County Election Committee that are just sitting around somewhere. There's no record or indication that they entered the mail system at all. Butler County went for President Trump in 2016 by 37 percentage points. 66 to 29. Now, I know that there are unscrupulous characters on both sides of the aisle, and there have been instances of election fraud on the part of Republicans. It's happened, but the overwhelming majority of these cases are on the part of the Democrats because they have terrible policies that normal people just won't vote for. So they have to resort to these tactics. 30,000 missing ballots is not a coincidence. In a county with about 150,000 registered voters, a fifth of the voters is a significant number. So please, someone please tell me how election fraud or voter fraud is not a threat to our election process and doesn't warrant any concern. If someone can present a cogent case, I'm willing to listen. But the argument has been that these instances are anecdotal and don't have any significant impact statistically. Well, in the minds of any leftist listening, at what point do all of these instances that are adding up cease being anecdotal and move into the realm of an actual threat to our elections. I contend that these instances, illegal aliens voting, people voting multiple times, is much more of a threat to our elections than Russia ever was, or Iran, or even China currently are. And we all know that these entities want to see Joe Biden win this November. And as I said earlier, if he wins, it will be a disaster for this country. Not just for our Second Amendment rights, as I mentioned, but across the board. Now, I'm not going to get into their whole platform, but I am just going to touch on a few, and maybe a little more than a few, lowlights and give you my overall perspective on it. Ben Franklin famously asked what type of government the delegates created when he was leaving the Constitutional Convention. His answer was a republic if you can keep it. Now, we hear all the time during each election season that that one is the most consequential election of our lifetime, which doesn't really mean a whole lot. Of course, it's the most consequential because the previous one has already taken place and either was a success like Reagan and Trump or has done its damage like Clinton and Obama. So whatever comes next is going to be more consequential in most cases than what's already been done. Now, I understand that there are exceptions to that, but you get my point. Now, having said that, I think that statement is even more true now given the polarization of our electorate. There is no middle ground anymore. You either hate Trump or you love what he's done for the country in the past 3.5 years. If you're undecided, you're just not paying attention and need to figure it the out. Anyway, this is different than previous contentious elections. The days of everyone loving the country and just having a different perspective on how to make it better, those days are over. We may get them back or a reasonable facsimile at some point, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. The current left is a completely different animal from the JFK Democrat. So most Republicans as well, frankly, they're still the closest to what conservatives can vote for, and they can be persuaded to do the right thing for the most part. But today's left is anti-constitution. Today's left believes that the citizens are beholden to the government, not the other way around. Not only that, they want citizens to be dependent on the government. Why do you think they want to disarm you? They can't subjugate you if you don't need them to protect you or feed you. But if the left with that philosophy gains power, the prospect of keeping that republic that Franklin spoke of becomes more and more remote. Well, come on, Biggie. Surely you're exaggerating just a bit, aren't you? Nah, I don't believe that I am. Let's take a look at some of the lowlights of their platform. They want to make housing a right. So let's talk about that for a second. Anytime you make something a right, you obligate someone else to accommodate you. Take healthcare. If healthcare is a right, then you are obligating doctors to work for you without proper compensation. If housing is a right, then you're obligating people who own the property to provide you that housing at their own cost, or in this case, the taxpayer's cost. Now, it's kind of a complicated subject, and I hope I'm explaining it right. And if you're not understanding it, please let me know so that we can go over it again. But some of the other things that they have in this platform, they want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We saw how that worked out in Seattle. They want to repeal right-to-work laws and giving unions more power than employers. They want to require contractors to prioritize hiring minorities and women. They want to create a taxpayer-funded option, public option, available through Obamacare. They want to repeal the Hyde Amendment and fight federal laws and state laws limiting abortion. They want tax-funded birth control. They want to end incarceration for drug offenses. They want to eliminate cash bail. We see how that worked out in New York. They want to repeal mandatory minimum sentences. They want to abolish the death penalty. And we already talked about HR 5717. They want to repeal the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which prevents gun manufacturers from being sued if someone uses their product illegally. They want to force businesses to serve customers even if it goes against their religious beliefs. They want to fight voter ID laws. Can someone explain to me, you can't do anything without ID in this country. Nothing. But why is voting an exception? Unless they want to commit voter fraud. They want to stop purging voter rolls. They reject America First policies. They want to rejoin the World Health Organization and fully fund it with taxpayer money. They want to increase taxpayer-funded foreign aid. They want to make D.C. and Puerto Rico states, making the U.S. a one-party country. They want to ban veterans from using their benefits at non-public education institutions. What sense does that make? And of course, they want to end suffering around the globe. A laudable goal, I guess, but why is it our responsibility? And then they want to pack the court. I'll just end with this. If you value your liberty, if you value your rights, if you value the lives of unborn children, if you value economic prosperity, voting for Biden just cannot be an option. You may not like Trump, but before the Chinese coronavirus, he presided over the best economy this country has seen since Reagan. He has governed as conservatively as anyone could have hoped for, and more than any of us had a right to expect. So don't let jabronis like this guy tell you differently.
I've been voting since 1984, when I proudly cast my first ballot for Ronald Reagan. I've been a conservative Republican my entire life. I've never before voted for a Democrat for president. But this year, principle and conscience require me to do just that. I'm voting for Joe Biden. My fellow Republicans, it's not easy going against the head of our party. Believe me, I know. But I also know that character, moral leadership, and integrity are values that we cannot put aside when we cast our vote for president. If we hold on to these values, our country will be better for it, and so will our party. And please, don't let anyone tell you that by casting your vote for Joe Biden, you are somehow not being conservative. This year, the most conservative thing you can do is to put country over party. That's what I'm doing. I hope you'll join me.
Character? Trump has a questionable past, yes. He dated porn stars, he cheated on wives. He was a billionaire playboy. Now, that's not an excuse, it's just a fact. We all have a past that I'm sure none of us want to be judged by forever. They investigated him for 3.5 years and found nothing. Meanwhile, allegations have been swirling for decades that Biden is corrupt. He had to drop out of the race in '87 for plagiarism. His family has been peddling his influence and cashing in on it since he entered the Senate in 1973. Yes, 73. So if character really is on the ballot, then Biden should not be considered a viable candidate. And didn't they explicitly tell us when Clinton was in office that character was not an issue? So which is it? Now, before we get you out of here, there are a couple of other stories I want to touch on. First, let's address this Hunter Biden story. I haven't really focused on it because I think it's too little too late. There's a lot there, but Biden's corruption is baked into the cake for most Democrat voters, especially the ones paying attention. The others, as we have addressed, probably never heard this or don't care. I've seen people post that they don't care about Biden's foreign entanglements because Trump or something. And conservatives who know about this stuff and the latest revelations are damning, but we know it's not gonna move the meter much. I know some people think that undecideds could be swayed, but I think I addressed the undecideds earlier in the show. And as far as the other stuff that's supposed to be on the laptop with regard to the pictures of him with a family member in a compromising position and his porn account, it really has no bearing because none of that involves his father's corruption. Now, if pictures of Joe and Hunter with these girls show up, well, then that's a whole other issue. But my problem is if Giuliani or the FBI had this stuff for the past year and waited till now to release it, then they should have dumped it all at once and let the American people see it and evaluate it for themselves. The election is actually going on right now, so doing this 2 weeks before the election in dribs and drabs just doesn't make any sense. A few days ago, 3 people were killed in a church in Nice, France, by an Islamic terrorist screaming Allahu Akbar before he beheaded one 60-year-old woman and sliced the throat of a 55-year-old man. A 44-year-old woman was stabbed several times but was able to escape, although she eventually died as a result of her injuries. Now, this follows the beheading of a teacher in France a couple of weeks ago. Samuel Paty was killed by 18-year-old Abdullah Anzarov. He was a Chechen who had been living in France since he was 6. He killed Paty because he showed the class cartoon depictions of Muhammad, the cartoon depictions of Muhammad that sparked the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks in 2015 during a lesson on free speech. Islam doesn't value freedom, free speech, the way normal people do. Was that Islamophobic? I don't really care. But I will say that France is actually responding pretty well, finally. They're carrying out raids against suspected Islamist networks, vowing to expel radicalized foreigners and dissolve organizations with extremist views and associations. And they also plan to submit legislation next month with the goal of fighting separatism, something aimed at the Islamic community for their penchant for setting up separatist communities within with their own government structures. It's not Islamophobia when they are literally beheading people on the street and in churches in the name of their religion. Cult, I should say. All right, let's get you out of here with some of the most galactically stupid things I've heard this week, and there was a ton to choose from, even with the lids on Biden's campaign. But first up, though, we have Joe Scarborough making a most ridiculous comparison and claim that should at least earn him a reprimand and would from a legitimate news organization. But take a look and a listen.
He really did. And it's really fascinating at this point to look how much Donald Trump resembles an autocratic leader from Eastern Europe, whether it's Belarus or whether it's Russia. Actually, though he kills journalists, Vladimir Putin on camera actually seems a little more willing to answer tough questions when they're asked of him. Donald Trump can't even handle that. Of course, Donald Trump would kill reporters if he could get away with it. He'd do, I think even his strongest supporters would admit Trump would do whatever he could get away with.
That was a response to Trump's 60 Minutes interview. Now, I didn't watch what aired on 60 Minutes broadcast, but I did watch the footage that the president released, and it was not a matter of not wanting to answer tough questions. There were 5 minutes left in their allotted time, so he decided to give that time to Vice President Pence. And they wonder why we call them fake news. Don Lemon. Now, I haven't called him out in a while, but he had a serious case of verbal diarrhea the other night. He and Cuomo were doing their normal handoff shtick, and eventually the conversation came around to this.
You know what the sad thing is, and I'll be honest with you. I have many people who I love in my life. There are a lot of friends who I had to really get rid of because they are so nonsensical. When it comes to this issue, they have every single talking point that they hear on state TV and that they hear from this president they repeat it and they are blinded by it, I had to get rid of them because they are too far gone. I try and I try and I try. They'll say something really stupid, and then I'll show them the science and I'll give them the information, and they still repeat those talking points. And I have to get rid of a lot of people in my life because sometimes you just have to let them go. I think that they have to hit rock bottom like an addict, right? And they have to want to get help. They have to want to know the truth. They have to want to live in reality. They have to want to be responsible, not only for other people's lives, but for their lives. So you know what? It's so sad. And I don't know if after this I will ever be able to go back and be friends with those people, because at a certain point you just say they're too far gone and I got to let them go. And if they're willing to come back and if they're willing to live in reality, then I will welcome them with open arms. But I can't do it. I can't do it anymore.
Okay, what is state TV? The propaganda is all coming from his station. And if you disagree with them and their orthodoxy, they get rid of you. If you disagree with Trump, you can disagree all you want, and no one is going to cancel you. No one is going to try and blacklist you from getting a job or anything like that. But when you disagree with the leftists, talk about fascists. Anyway, I wanted to talk about this in more depth, and maybe we will next week, but I wanted to at least mention it this week because it is important. Oregon is keeping Christian schools closed due to the Chinese coronavirus, while public schools are allowed to remain open. Governor Kate Brown is allowing small schools with fewer than 75 students to reopen, but private religious schools are not going to be able to take advantage of that rule. Even though private religious schools were told all summer that they would be allowed to open for in-person instruction. So parents who were counting on being able to send their kids to school are now going to be forced to send their kids to public school or homeschool them. Now, I hope they choose homeschooling because the less children sent to those indoctrination camps, the better. Now, there's a lot more to dig into with that story, but we're going to have to do it another time, hopefully next week. And finally, we have more Joe Biden stuff to get into. But it's not really funny anymore. And I've said all along that his family is doing him a disservice, although it recently crossed my mind that they might be seeing it as one last chance to cash in and don't really care about his health. Either way, it's still sad. Check this out.
Home. Home is where your character is etched. At my grandpa's table. My grandpa was named Ambrose Finnegan. At his kitchen table, I learned a lot of basic lessons. 1, money does not determine your wealth. 20 million people worried about whether they can make next month's mortgage payment. He said, it is what it is. Well, it is what it is because he is who he is. That's why it is what it is. I'll do what he's unable to do. I'll lead an effective strategy to mobilize true international effort to pressure, isolate, and punish China. Donald Trump thinks health care is a privilege. I think it's a right. Barack and I think it's a right for people to have bad health care. Well, I'm sick and tired of smart guys. I don't only need you to get me elected, I need you once I'm elected. This isn't a political statement like those ugly folks over there.
I threw that last one in there, even though it was from a different appearance. Actually, there were a couple from different appearances, but I think they need to adjust his meds because it's obvious that they have him on something, and when they wear off, he sounds like a blithering idiot. And I know I've said in the past that I didn't want to make fun of him because it's sad to watch. And then I said that he's in the public sphere running for president, so he gets the full ride. But now I'm back to thinking his family should have put a stop to this. But the more I think about it, the more I think that it's one last cash grab. Anyway, folks, that's our show. I will try to do better the next time. But thank you all for watching or listening. If you're watching on Rumble, please take a second to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. If you're listening to the audio only version, Check us out on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or whichever podcast platform you prefer. And please like and subscribe and leave us a review. It would really help us out. Our website is thelibertycast.net. Go to the podcast page and you'll find all the latest podcasts. We're also on therightway.site. And of course, we're on social media, Parler, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Liberty Cast on all 4 of those platforms. Again, thank you all for taking some time to watch or listen. And until next time, keep your head in a swivel and stay safe, everybody.